Howdy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Fall William Waldo Cameron Forum. Tonight's featured speaker is Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council of Foreign Relations. The Council is the most prominent nonpartisan foreign policy institute in the United States and indeed throughout the whole world. So we are indeed deeply honored to have Dr. Haass with us. Tonight, Dr. Haass will be speaking about the Middle East, in particular the Iraqi situation. And more specifically, he'll be making reference to his latest book, The War of Necessity, War of Necessity and War of Choice, which was recently published and which will be available for a book signing after his lecture here tonight. Dr. Haass has a long and distinguished career as a public servant. He served in the administration of President George Bush 41 and in the administration of President George W. Bush 43. During President 41's administration, he was Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. During the time he worked for President George W. Bush, he was Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. In both instances, he was a key policymaker when it came to the Middle East, and in particular to the Iraqi situation, which he will be discussing here tonight. Dr. Haass is prepared to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, after which he'll be happy to take questions, as I mentioned. Those of you who may have a question for Dr. Haass can pose the question by using the microphones that are pre-positioned in the aisles toward the front of the auditorium. As I mentioned at the outset, Dr. Haass will be available afterwards to sign copies of his book in the lobby, and so we invite you to join us for that occasion, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any additional questions you have as you come up to the table to get your book signed. I would be remiss if I don't acknowledge Flo Creighton. Ms. Creighton is the underwriter of tonight's program. The Cameron Forum was established by her generosity in memory of her late father. So we are indeed very grateful to her support of this program and indeed for her support for the Library Center overall. I'm sorry she cannot join us here tonight, but I just want to acknowledge her, and we'll make sure that she will hear what was going on here, because we will deliver a tape to her. So make sure you applaud loud and very hard on this program. It is very honorable for me to have Dr. Haass here for the simple reason that I worked with Richard when he was at the NSC during President Bush No. 41's administration. I interacted almost on a daily basis with Richard because the Middle East obviously was a very pressing issue during that time, particularly when it came to the situation in Kuwait and then the eventual war with Iraq. I found Richard to be always professional, very knowledgeable, and with a great sense of humor, which made a lot of those trying days go by very quickly and in a very congenial fashion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm Aggie welcome for Dr. Richard Haass.
I want to thank my good friend, the ambassador. And it's great to be back here. I think it's my third visit here. I was here once with Brent Scowcroft and with 41, and once with Bob Gates, and now for a third time. So it's great to be back on these grounds. What I thought I'd do is say a few things about the book, about the history that's behind it, and then open it up for questions about anything I've talked about, or we can take it broader than that if you all would like. The book is called War of Necessity, War of Choice, and it's a memoir. What you had were two wars between a guy named George Bush and a fellow named Saddam Hussein in a country called Iraq. Two George Bushes, obviously, and two very different wars. And while there's a surface resemblance, Bush, Iraq, war, and so forth, the resemblance doesn't last for long. Indeed, you don't have to drill down very much to see some fundamental differences. The first war was a war of necessity. Wars of necessity are wars where the vital interests of the United States are at stake and where there's no viable alternative to the use of military force. The reason the first Iraq War or Gulf War, as it's sometimes called, was a war of necessity and this is actually a good week to be talking about it, is it came less than 9 months after 11/9, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this was the first great crisis of the post-Cold War world, and the president, Brent Scowcroft, and everyone else associated with the decision was very conscious that what was done and how it was done would set all sorts of precedents that would in turn help shape the character of this new and unfolding period of history. So there was a sense of tremendous stakes in the large, but there were also tremendous stakes in the small. And by that I mean Iraq itself controlled 10% of the world's oil. With Kuwait, it then controlled a fifth of the world's oil, 20%. But also, if Iraq had been able to get away with keeping Kuwait, in our view, Saudi Arabia might have remained independent in name, but it would not have been independent in reality. And it would have given Saddam Hussein strategic sway over the entire region of the Middle East, and we thought that if he were able to do that, he would be able to fulfill virtually any agenda, be it related to weapons of mass destruction or violence against Israel or anything else. So we thought the stakes, both particular and global, were enormous, which made it a war of necessity in terms of the importance. In terms of, we tried other things. If you recall, the invasion took place in early August 1990. It was actually Brent Scowcroft and I who told the president. I had been at a meeting all day when the intelligence was showing that Saddam Hussein was building up, and it was at the State Department, only because Bob Gates, who normally would have chaired the meeting, was on leave, hiking around someplace out west in the way that former scouts still tend to do. And so Bob was at the meeting, and I was deputized. I was given the unappetizing job of going back and persuading the president that he ought to get on the phone to Saddam Hussein to try to persuade him not to do that it increasingly looked like he was about to do. So I called Brent and said, I got to talk to you. So I went over to the West Wing, told Brent what the situation was, and he said, okay. And so we went over to the president wasn't in his office. He was actually in the infirmary. And what we did was brief him. He was prone, we were not. And we briefed him on the situation. And we were literally talking about the mechanics of how to do it, about how you would reach, because at this point it was probably about 6, 7 at night in Washington, which made it early in the morning in Baghdad. So we were having this rather odd conversation about how we would get Saddam Hussein on the phone, whether we go through their ambassador in Washington, who was something less than a trustworthy figure, or whether we do it through our person there. Now, while our ambassador was away at the time, the number 2 person was there, and the whole idea of who was going to wake up Saddam Hussein. And every once in a while, I think the expression "shoot the messenger" might have originated. Anyhow, we were literally debating what would be the best way to go about this, what might actually work, even though we were skeptical that an entreaty at this point would have any effect. And while we were doing it, the phone rang, and it was the acting Secretary of State, Bob Kimmett, calling up saying, we just got word from our embassy in Kuwait that shots were being heard, Iraqi troops were coming across the border. And what then happened for the next several months is we tried everything. We tried diplomacy. We tried 6 months of economic sanctions and so forth. And nothing we could try would work to get Saddam Hussein to fulfill the various UN resolutions fully and unconditionally. And by the time the war was launched in January of 1991, we really felt that we had exhausted the alternatives. And at that point, if we didn't act soon, not only would we protect our strategic interests, again, the geopolitical one as well as energy, but we felt there wasn't going to be much of a Kuwait left to save. There was a sense of urgency. And so the war of necessity was joined with when Operation Desert Shield morphed into Operation Desert Storm. What's interesting is, as you know,